Hey, Jenny, let me introduce her. This is Nicole. She's my new wife. I'm divorcing you because I'm going to live with Nicole. Just so you know, it's all your fault, okay? You're useless, couldn't even have a kid. My husband Steve stated this in a matter-of-fact tone, as if he was delivering a business update. Beside him stood Nicole, a beauty worthy of a model, smiling as if she had triumphed. Her belly was swollen, clearly indicating she was pregnant. Normally, one would be furious to hear such a thing said so blatantly. But I responded in an even more matter-of-fact tone than my husband. Divorce? That's not possible. See, I've been single for a month now. Steve and Nicole looked stunned but soon started laughing, mocking me. Single for a month? What are you talking about? Don't say nonsense just because you're upset. That's why I took him from you. You should have gotten your brain treated before your infertility treatment. Despite their harsh words, I remained calm. Because I knew everything. The ones who really need mental treatment are the two in front of me. Just watch. I'll make sure you regret this. It seems you don't understand, so I'll say it again. Steve and I are no longer married. We became strangers over a month ago. They burst out laughing loudly at this. Oh, really funny. Seriously, I don't get it. Really, I didn't think you were that dumb. I thought you were a bit smarter. We weren't a good match. Better you leave early.
Yeah.
We're already divorced apparently. Can't you accept the reality that you're thrown away? Just get out, Jenny. I'm remarrying Nicole, and she will be moving into this house soon. Do as you like. I'm already divorced and will be leaving soon. Steve and Nicole laughed hysterically, finding the exchange amusing. No matter how much they pitied me now, it had no effect on me. I took a sip of my coffee, which seemed to annoy Steve as he twitched his eyebrows in irritation. Hey, Jenny. Since you seem too dumb to understand, let me explain. Divorce is something that's finalized by filing the divorce papers. Don't think you hold any control. I am divorcing you, a woman who can't bear children, with this divorce paper. With a bang, Steve slammed the divorce papers he had signed on the desk. Steve, you're used to writing divorce papers, aren't you? How many times are you gonna fill them out? Huh? What are you talking about? You've been writing several divorce papers lately, threatening, is it okay, to divorce? I happily signed one of them and filed it a month ago. Steve was shocked. Not having imagined that the divorce papers he half-jokingly filled out were actually submitted. So, as I said, you and I have been strangers for a month now. I'm happily single. My ex-husband Steve, who always looked down on me, could not have imagined being outmaneuvered without knowing. But Steve. Originally, we needed to be divorced to marry, right? This worked out for the best, didn't it?
Ah.
Right. It's convenient for us. Thanks, Jenny. No need for a divorce hassle now. Steve sarcastically thanked me. You're welcome. Glad I could help. I smiled back sarcastically, and Steve clicked his tongue in annoyance. Yes, Steve and I are now strangers. Therefore, I can keep pushing you as far as I can. Pfft, keep up your bravado. Mom's coming home soon. We'll tell her about the marriage with Nicole. You can join us for that. As Steve said this, the sound of the front door opening was heard. It seemed his mother had returned home. The mother-in-law appeared in the living room and, with a glance, seemed to understand the situation. She approached her sons with a triumphant smile.
Ah.
Nicole, welcome. Your belly has grown quite a bit. How's your health? Thank you, both the baby and I are doing well. See, totally different from a useless woman who can't bear children. Without turning her back on me, the mother-in-law, like Steve, delivered her sarcastic comments. Being infertile is practically the end for a woman. Steve is an elite employee of a major company, and Jenny, you never matched up to him. You were never a match from the start. Indeed, Steve was recognized at the company, even acknowledged by the president. Originally, I worked at the same workplace as Steve. But now, there was a big issue between us. We couldn't have children. We tried actively to conceive, but to no avail. Perhaps that possibility had crossed my husband's mind from the beginning, leading to the breakdown of our marriage. Mom, I'm marrying Nicole. We're having a baby. There's no reason not to marry. Oh, that's great, finally. But I'm surprised that mean woman let you divorce so easily. I went ahead with the divorce myself, former mother-in-law. I dumped Steve. The mother-in-law's face shifted from calm to furious as she approached me aggressively. Watch your mouth. Aren't you working at a subsidiary of Steve's company right now? If we spread rumors about your infertility there, you're done. Indeed, such actions would make me suffer greatly. I met Steve when he was assigned to the subsidiary where I still work. While Steve is now flourishing back at the main company, I continue to work at the subsidiary. If that rumor about me being a useless woman who was discarded by the subsidiary because she couldn't have children were to spread, it would be unbearable. But that's only if it were true. I say, breaking into a smile. You should watch how you speak as well. I know something interesting that you all are unaware of. It was amusing to see the three of them, Steve, Nicole, and the mother-in-law, making foolish faces together. Something interesting? What could you possibly know? We don't need to entertain such nonsense. Just throw her out already. Her mere presence is displeasing. No, this isn't nonsense. Unlike Steve and Nicole, I don't lie. Could you stop making it sound like Steve and I are liars? Is this just spite because your husband abandoned you? Aren't you liars, though? For instance, Nicole, what lies did you tell your husband to come here today? Husband? What do you mean by that? Nicole's husband. She's already married, after all. Steve and the mother-in-law simultaneously turned to look at Nicole. Nicole's face momentarily paled, but she quickly started to laugh it off. See, you're such a liar. How dare you make up such nonsense that I have a husband? Steve and the mother-in-law nodded and laughed along. How stupid can you get, Jenny? Just spouting nonsense. No matter what lies you spew now, it's useless. Steve won't be coming back to you. It's pitiful, really. Give up and go back home. A woman who can't have children has no value. I smiled mockingly back at Nicole. Then why don't you check for yourself whether it's a lie or not? What do you mean? As I said before, I've already filed for divorce and it's finalized. So, Steve is free to marry. A married person can't marry again, right? I took out a piece of paper from my bag and slammed it on the table. It was an unfiled marriage certificate. Nicole, if you're not married, you can file this marriage certificate right now, can't you? That is. Since I'm such a useless person, I thought I'd at least be useful in this regard. Please, don't mind me and go ahead with your marriage. Though I urged her, Nicole didn't reach for the marriage certificate. Steve then stepped in between us. Enough already. Stop saying whatever you want. We'll marry when we're ready on our own terms. Steve snatched the marriage certificate from the table and tore it up roughly. I married you on a whim and it was a mistake. I won't make that mistake again. I'll meet her parents, kick you out of the house, and do everything that needs to be done before marrying Nicole. How pathetic. You seem like you're scared of something. What? What did you say? Say that again. Steve looked like he was about to grab me. I took out another envelope from my bag and slid it across the table to him. What's this? A present for poor you. Steve irritably picked up the envelope and tore it open roughly. He pulled out a piece of paper and looked at it. His face, which had been composed, froze. The color drained from his face, and he started to tremble. The mother-in-law and Nicole leaned in from both sides, their eyes widening simultaneously. What does this mean? The piece of paper, gripped so tightly it wrinkled, was gently explained by me to my pitiful ex-husband. That's the result of your male infertility diagnosis. It seems there's an issue with your sperm. Unfortunately, you can't have children. I also included my diagnosis. Steve frantically pulled another piece of paper from the envelope. My reproductive functions are normal. The hospital determined that. Do you understand what I'm saying? Steve's face turned bright red as he desperately refused to accept reality. The reason we couldn't have children wasn't because of me. It's because of you, Steve. Steve's face turned pale. He was clearly unable to accept this information. He kept rereading the diagnosis, desperately trying to deny what it stated. However, the contents on the paper wouldn't change. This is a lie. It can't be true. Unfortunately, this is the truth. Stop talking nonsense. How could you diagnose my infertility without my cooperation? I sighed deeply. When we first suspected we couldn't have children, I suggested that you undergo fertility treatment. But you insisted the problem was with me and were uncooperative, right? I wanted children just as much. If it was said I was infertile, then I should receive treatment. However, tests at the hospital revealed there was nothing wrong with my reproductive functions. Thinking a just in case, I secretly took a sample from you and had it tested. And that's the result of your infertility diagnosis. Why would you do such a thing without telling me? You're just a wife, stop messing around. I wanted to tell you all along. Indeed, the diagnosis results had been known for quite some time. It wasn't something I had only recently found out. But when you decided I was infertile, you started going out more and working late, ignoring all my calls and emails. Eventually, I gave up trying to reach you. By that time, our relationship had completely cooled off. Every time Steve saw me, he would insult me, calling me infertile and useless. He looked down on me because he was a big company employee and made every effort to trap me. At the same time, I started something else. You, who wanted children so badly, started distancing yourself from me. It's only natural to think you were trying to have children with someone else. That's why I hired a detective to investigate your infidelity. I've known all along that you were cheating on me with Nicole. Steve stood there speechless. The mother-in-law was also trying to suppress her anger, her face turning bright red. However, both of them had a deep look of disturbance in their eyes. I felt a sense of relief. Steve still refused to admit it. There's no way I'm infertile. How dare you forge such documents? This is a crime, I'll sue you. Go ahead. It'll be you who ends up embarrassed. Be sure to let me know the results. Steve stumbled over his words at my confident demeanor. He began to sweat profusely, perhaps starting to accept reality. I'm not infertile. Nicole is pregnant, isn't she? Steve desperately argued. I shrugged my shoulders. Didn't you listen to what I said? Nicole is already married, you know? She has a legitimate husband besides you. Is it so surprising that she could get pregnant? Steve glared at Nicole. Initially, he outright denied it, but gradually he began to see the credibility in my words. However, Nicole stubbornly denied it. No, that's wrong. I am single. I've never been married. The baby in my belly is Steve's. You might want to thoroughly check the paternity after the child is born. As I mentioned earlier, the hospital has confirmed abnormalities in Steve's reproductive abilities. It's not 100%, so keep praying. I hope for your sake that the child is not your husband's, but Steve's. The likelihood was extremely low, but Nicole wouldn't admit it and began to scream hysterically. No. It's all lies. Jenny, you've prepared all these lies to deceive us. Her words were interrupted by the ringing of the doorbell at the in-laws' house. It was an unexpected visitor, but no one seemed to have the energy to go to the door. Reluctantly, I stood up and went to greet the guest. On time, there was a person standing outside. I welcomed him in and led him to the living room. The visitor was a man in a suit. His attire was well-groomed, his suit glossy and sharp. He clearly seemed to be a man of high standing. However, inviting a visitor suddenly during a crucial discussion was unusual. The mother-in-law glared at me fiercely, wondering what I was planning. Only Steve and Nicole reacted differently. They were stunned and looked around in shock. Since the mother-in-law seemed unaware of who he was, I decided to introduce him. This is Mr. Kevin Powell. I thought it's appropriate to have him come today. Despite the mother-in-law's suspicious look, I turned my eyes to Steve and Nicole. No need to introduce him to the two of you, right?
Ah.
President Powell, why are you here? Indeed, Mr. Powell was the president of the company where Steve worked. Being the president of a large corporation, he was very busy. But he agreed to help when I explained the situation. Mr. Powell glanced briefly at Steve but then directed his gaze towards Nicole. Nicole shuddered under his stare. Why are you here? Asked Mr. Powell. He spoke in a stern, low voice. If I hear that my wife is up to foolishness, I have to come. Steve looked at Nicole in shock. Mr. Powell was not only the president of Steve's company but also Nicole's husband. This meant that Steve had unwittingly become involved with the wife of his company's president. It was a daring act, but Steve hadn't realized it because Nicole was using her maiden name. She had hidden her married status and was planning to divorce and remarry Steve just before their marriage. So she had been using her maiden name in advance. Nicole. Explain what this means. This is, well. Nicole, now being questioned by Mr. Powell, lost all her previous bravado. She only shivered like a frightened deer. Mr. Powell probably wanted to hear a plausible explanation from Nicole. That a strange woman had fed him nonsense. However, by stepping directly into the scene and seeing Nicole's demeanor, he must have realized everything was true. For a moment, Mr. Powell looked down sadly, then turned his gaze to Steve. Steve, it's been a while since our last meeting. His words were calm, but his tone subtly revealed clear anger. President, this is a misunderstanding. Mr. Powell's face burned with intensity. I've heard all about your misconduct. To think you'd cheat with my wife and insult your own wife as infertile. Touched by the president's fury, Steve shrank and trembled. So. Nicole really is Mr. Powell's wife. It seemed Steve finally understood that he had been deceived by Nicole. President, it's not like that. I was deceived by your wife. Nicole. Why did you lie to me? You knew I worked at the president's company, didn't you? Nicole bit her lip and averted her gaze. She didn't make excuses, nor did she explain her reasons. As Nicole continued to remain silent, Mr. Powell spoke up. The reason Nicole deceived you, Steve, is simply money. Nicole clenched her teeth in frustration but did not deny the accusations. It seemed that after marrying her, Mr. Powell had realized her terrible spending habits. If left unchecked, it appeared she would even dip into the company's funds. Reluctantly, Mr. Powell had taken over managing the finances, giving Nicole only the money she needed. I had been noticing something odd about Nicole for a while now. I thought she was making purchases beyond the money I gave her. Expensive brand bags, new cosmetic products, even fashionable, high-quality clothes. It reminded me more and more of her spending right after we got married. As Mr. Powell's anger became apparent, Nicole looked like she might start crying at any moment. When I told Mr. Powell that Nicole was cheating, it seemed to click for him. I was impressed thinking she was spending her own earned money. But it appears that wasn't the case. Glared at by Mr. Powell, Nicole clenched her fists in frustration. Mr. Powell's words seemed entirely truthful. Thus, Nicole had approached Steve with financial motives, encouraging him to spend money on her. Perhaps to her, Steve, who provided her with money, was preferable to being unable to spend freely, even as the president's wife. If she had a child while still married to me, naturally the money she could spend would decrease. That's why she planned to divorce me and remarry Steve, who would let her spend freely. For such reasons, Steve was utterly devastated, his shoulders slumped. Mr. Powell approached the cowering Steve and glared at his own employee. But what I cannot forgive, more than the infidelity of Steve or Nicole, is how they treated Jenny. It's unknown where the issue of not having children lies. And yet to insult your wife as infertile and useless. It boils my blood to think I had valued such a man. I was overwhelmed. Steve began speaking hesitantly. I felt crushed by the pressure. The expectations from the company, as a husband. I felt like my value was diminishing because we couldn't have children. I just wanted to show my mom a grandchild and repay her. Steve, my dad died when I was a child, and Mom raised me alone. I wanted to repay her somehow. But as Jenny and I couldn't have children, I gradually began to resent her. I got involved with Nicole because I wanted children. Steve continued, looking for forgiveness from his boss. I knew that my actions towards Jenny and the affair were wrong. But I couldn't stop. I just wanted children so badly. Steve then collapsed to the floor, pressing his forehead to the ground in a full bow. I'm really sorry. I was wrong. Please forgive me. Mr. Powell listened silently to Steve's confession, then sighed quietly. I can understand your desire to have children, which is common to everyone. However, that doesn't excuse infidelity or mistreating your wife. The mistakes you've made are not forgivable. Yes. I understand. Steve turned toward me with tears in his eyes and apologized again. Jenny. I'm truly sorry. I was wrong, please forgive me. I smiled faintly. Well, if you promise not to lie anymore, maybe I could forgive you. Steve's face brightened despite his tears. Yes, I won't lie anymore. I'll do better, so. I understand, Steve. Then I will not forgive you. Huh? Steve made a confused sound. Steve, didn't I tell you? I hired a detective to investigate the affair. Detective. Steve's face paled instantly. It seems you understand what I'm saying. Steve avoided my gaze as I smiled at him. Jenny, what do you mean? Is he still hiding something? Yes, exactly. Mr. Powell, I'm afraid I have some disappointing news for you as well. I pulled a notebook from my bag and began reading out some names. All the names were of women. All these names seemed to be employees of our company. Mr. Powell noticed the change in Steve's demeanor. Steve, sweating profusely, looked ready to flee. The names I just read are of women Steve was involved with, besides Nicole. It seems there were others outside the company as well. What? Steve, you? No, President. It's not like that with them. I have evidence. I threw a pile of photos onto the living room table. The photos showed Steve meeting various women, from dining scenes to entering hotels. There was countless evidence. I crouched in front of a shrunken Steve. I guess I understand why you had so many mistresses. You kind of knew, didn't you? That the reason we couldn't have children wasn't me. But perhaps yourself. You had relationships with many, and yet no children came. So, you kept trying with different women, right? Saying it's okay, if a child comes, you'd take responsibility. The only person you found out was pregnant was Nicole. And you started talking about marrying her just because of that, right? Shut up, Jenny. Unable to bear it anymore, Steve lunged at me. But before his hand could reach me, Mr. Powell grabbed it. Steve, enough. I am not infertile. I am. As Steve shouted these unbearable words, Nicole was furious. What do you mean, Steve? Did you mean that any woman would do as long as she could have a child? And you were saying you'd marry me just because I got pregnant? Were you deceiving me? Don't joke around. You were just using me. Steve broke free from Mr. Powell's restraint and showed his anger defiantly. Shut up. You were deceiving me too. And to think you were not even in a position to get married, don't act all high and mighty. What are you talking about? You were the one deceiving. Watching the two of them hurl insults at each other was pitiful, and Mr. Powell was exasperated. Steve, Nicole. I will ensure you both receive the punishment you deserve. Don't think you can just get away with this. Be prepared. Receiving a reprimand from someone they clearly could not defy. Both Steve and Nicole fell silent. At that moment, the mother-in-law, who had been unable to interject, approached Mr. Powell. Mr. Powell. I apologize for the trouble my son has caused. Please. I beg your forgiveness. The mother-in-law tried to intercede, but Mr. Powell ignored her words. As soon as she realized her plea was futile, she approached me. Jenny, I am so sorry. It was our fault. Please help Steve. Explain to Mr. Powell. No. I shouldn't be involved with Steve anymore. Mother-in-law, remember what you told me? That I was a useless woman who couldn't have children. Not suitable for your elite son. Therefore, I will gracefully withdraw. The mother-in-law was left speechless. I gathered only my belongings and headed to the entrance. I won't be coming back to this house. I had already established a new living situation elsewhere. Although I had been living in this in-law's house, I had moved most of my belongings to the new place. Now, all that was left was to end this rotten relationship. Also, I will be seeking compensation through my lawyer for this ordeal. To Steve, mother-in-law, and Nicole, all three of you. For the divorce, for calling me infertile and useless. I won't leave things half done. I will make sure you feel the depths of hell, so be prepared. Having completed all necessary arrangements, I left the in-laws' house feeling liberated. Later on, my ex-husband Steve was sued for a significant amount in damages by both me and Mr. Powell. Even as an employee of a large corporation, he faced a substantial financial impact. Furthermore, he was thoroughly investigated for his infidelities. Steve was also fired from the company. Normally, an affair wouldn't lead to dismissal. However, it turned out that Steve had been using company facilities for his liaisons with women he was involved with at the office. Mr. Powell and the other executives were furious. He was immediately dismissed and thrown out of the company. Though he had prided himself on being an elite employee of a large corporation, he could never have imagined losing everything in an instant. Meanwhile, Nicole safely gave birth to her child. As expected, DNA tests confirmed that the child was indeed Mr. Powell's. However, Nicole was served with divorce papers by Mr. Powell. He couldn't forgive her betrayal and decided to take custody of the child. Nicole lost everything and was forced to live a lonely life. I heard a little about Steve's subsequent life from Mr. Powell and the lawyer. Steve was living with his mother in their family home. Although they had been close before, this incident had strained their relationship. They blamed each other for their respective roles in what had happened. His reason for dismissal made it difficult for him to find another job. He could have managed if he had lowered his standards. But his useless pride kept him applying only to major companies. Broken, he came back to me for help. But I coldly rejected him. My life was no longer for Steve. On the other hand, I was living a new life. I used to work at a subsidiary of Mr. Powell's company. I thought it would be difficult to continue working there like Steve. But thanks to Mr. Powell's generosity, I was allowed to keep my job. I worked hard to regain what I had lost during the years affected by my relationship with Steve. My efforts were recognized, and I was given a significant position within the company. I then met a wonderful man and fell in love. He was sincere and cherished me. Together with my new husband, I was blessed with the child we had longed for. My life was truly fulfilled, and I savored the happiness. While raising our child, I occasionally thought about the incident involving me and Steve. What had gone wrong? I believe there were times when I was at fault too. When we got married, when we couldn't have children, when our relationship deteriorated. We should have talked sooner. If there was a fault, it should have been acknowledged. Steve, Nicole, and the mother-in-law always thought they weren't to blame. It's wrong to blame others. As I build a family with my husband and child, I will surely make many mistakes. But I won't run from them. We will acknowledge our faults and build a happy home together.